So we're here today with Helena Sheehan, who is one of the world's leading Marxist scholars and a very vibrant activist. She is a professor emeritus at Dublin City University, has published widely within the Marxist tradition, is perhaps most well known for her work on the philosophy of science, though she's also written two important autobiographies recently that frame her own life in relationship to the broader kind of movement for left politics and Marxist politics more specifically. And it's with this that I would like to start. So the Marxist tradition has sometimes been disingenuously accused of ignoring subjective experience in favor of a systemic analysis of the social totality. You've written two autobiographies delving into the nuances of your own subjective life, but your approach is far from being simply subjectivist in the sense of indulging in your experiences independently of how they're situated in the broader material world. You write, for instance, quote, "I'm striving for something more than memoir, for work of intellectual, social, and political history within the narrative frame of autobiography," end quote. Could you explain why it is that you decided to write two autobiographies while also discussing your method in doing so? How did you draw on your life to write something more than a memoir by relating your life as a subject to the broader objective world?
Okay, so first of all, about that criticism of Marxism, which, as you imply, has been somewhat unfair. There is a body of work about the relationship of psyche to society. For example, authors such as Vygotsky, Luria, Sev, Schaff. There's some contemporary writing about the relationship between capitalism and mental health. Any Amazon search will yield some interesting titles that way. I think the important point, though, is that Marxism has the capacity to do what other schools of psychology don't do. That is to conceive of the relationship of psyche to society in a sound way. So I think that Marxism has all the elements of a superior approach to psychology, to dealing with the whole psychological dimension. But I think that there is some justification in the criticism because I think that this is underemphasized and underdeveloped, and some Marxists don't pay much attention to this whole dimension as well. And I feel it's very important, and I intend addressing this even more in my future work because I believe that the current mental health crisis is basically a crisis in worldview. And Marxism needs to be much more active in this area because other people that are dealing with it are talking nonsense about it and sometimes even doing more harm than good. Well, for example, I was just a few days ago, I was just listening to Irish Current Affairs Radio, and they have these psychologists on, giving advice to the populace. And this particular program was about advising parents who have had children who commit suicide. And a lot of this goes unreported and undiscussed. And I know from my own experience of, people whose children and grandchildren have committed suicide, seem to have everything going for them. And I think it is a lot of the times a crisis in meaning. But anyway, the point that this one guy, a clinical psychologist, kept making over and over was, don't ask why. I think that was exactly the wrong advice, exactly the wrong analysis of this situation. So I think that we need to be in there dealing with that. So about writing autobiographies, I have to admit I feel a bit defensive about this because I even slightly embarrassed sometimes because I feel I have to explain that, I'm not an egomaniac, that I do know I'm not a celebrity. I haven't scored any glorious goals. I haven't starred in any blockbuster movies. I don't have hundreds of thousands of followers as an influencer. I haven't made any groundbreaking discoveries in finding a cure for cancer or new theory about black holes. I have no algorithm to zap fake news. But I've lived a life and I've processed the world. And I've found this is an effective way of dealing with what I feel I have to say about the world as a result of that. But I think the question, and you've alluded to this in your question, about it has a particular edge when it's asked of a Marxist. Why should a Marxist write autobiography? I mean, aren't we supposed to be more interested in the forces of history than the particularities of personality? And my answer to that is that a well-written historical materialist autobiography is an account of a life, but about more than a life. Done well, it's an account of many lives and a whole panorama of social experience. And the whole thing about forces of history, we experience forces of history by living a life. And I think Marxists, of all people, should write autobiographies. There aren't enough Marxists writing autobiographies. I think that we need to, because we have a clearer and deeper sense of the relationship between the psychological and the social. And we need to be explicit about this. We need to explicitly conceptualize the relationship between self and society, to express the epical in the immediate, the concrete, the vivid, and to write biographical narrative that has a thrust to grand narrative. Because I think what gives a narrative force is this thrust to meta-narrative, to a life that opens a panorama of many lives. And I think whether a person is conscious or not, a person is formed by this whole torrent of events and forces. And from a very young age, I decided to do this in a conscious way. I didn't even quite have the vocabulary for it. But even as a child, I was always interested. I didn't even know terms like worldview, let alone Weltanschauung. But I wanted to see the big picture. I always strove to do that. Of course, Catholicism provided, a comprehensive worldview, along with this demand to, give totally to it. That's shaped me. So what I've tried to do is to navigate the zeitgeist, to feel the pulse of the times. But I focused particularly on the movements in which I participated personally, but to set them in a wider, deeper context within this whole web of interacting forces. How well I've done that is another question, but this is what I was striving to do. And I also did it because I believe in the power of narrative. I think that storytelling is a far more fundamental activity than people realize. I think that a lot of our cognitive activity is actually a kind of sorting out of stories. I think we interpret the world and other people through stories. On the walk here, we were, telling different stories, about, different people. And we'll be doing that, I think, all evening. I think that I felt that I had to really be explicit about this, and I've written actually about narrative and storytelling, and my writing in the area of culture. A lot of it is about narrative and criteria for dealing with narrative. So and I think that we need to deal with individual experience in such a way that it opens out to social experience. So that's what I was trying to do in these books. And also it's very influenced by the whole atmosphere of the 1960s, the personalist political and consciousness raising and all this that I experienced within the political movements of our time. Early, 1970s feminism was very much about, telling our personal stories that were, lighting up other people's stories.
Wonderful. Well, you're a major intellectual, but you're also a dedicated activist. And I'm curious at the most general level how you understand the relationship between the theoretical work that you do and the practical work. In what ways do they inform one another? How do you elucidate that relationship?
I can't imagine the one without the other. They're just so interconnected on so many levels. I long ago adopted a participational theory of truth. I don't believe you know the world better by detaching yourself from it. I think you know the world better by actively interacting and participating in it. And so I believe that my activism is actually epistemologically important for me in my theoretical work. It's not only that I know things that I wouldn't know otherwise, but I experience the world in a fuller and deeper way because I'm involved with it in that way. I think my activism kind of earths me in a kind of way. And my my intellectual work is shaped by my activism, but also vice versa. A lot of my activism actually has been organizing intellectual activities within the movement, lecture series and weekend schools and things like you're doing here in Paris. I think that is a lot of what, what are we trying to do on the left? We're trying to win people's hearts and minds. We have to make, people see what is the real source of their problems, what are the real forces at work in the world. So, I think a lot of left activity is intellectual. And so in my early days in the left, in the New Left in the US, a lot of people were, students and professors that I was involved with. I mean, there's a wide range of people. But when I became active in the Irish left, particularly when I was in the Communist Party, my branch of the Communist Party was almost entire male manual workers. And I had to speak in a way that, was meaningful to them. I had to put up with, a certain degree of bullying anti-intellectualism, and which also had a certain, gender tinge to it sometimes. But even that, I think, has been good for me to have to deal with that. But basically, I felt, from that time, which is half a century now, I've always felt I had to justify myself to construction workers. Not somebody that just came in drunk and, hated the whole idea of feminism and would just slag me off, during the whole lecture. But the ones that are serious, a lot of the people I've known on the left were people who worked on building sites all day and then went to lectures on dialectical materialism. And then within a few years, they were giving the lectures. And I lived for 42 years with somebody like that. My partner was a construction worker, trade union official, and for many years, he was the first reader of everything I wrote. He left school as a teenager, but he read vastly. These were kind of people that were in the left. They're disappearing now. The kind of working class autodidact who took knowledge really seriously and got their education in the movement. I found my partner was far more educated in a certain way than a lot of my academic colleagues were. But for years he was the first reader of everything that I wrote. And even now I can hear his voice, when I'm ready to show somebody what I've written. So, I just don't understand sometimes how intellectuals can be so detached from the world that they, purport to explain. And I really don't understand how Marxist intellectuals cannot be activists. I just don't understand it. And it shows in their work. They write texts about texts about texts, ideas about ideas about ideas. And so, I can't understand what it would be to be a Marxist intellectual and not be an activist.
That's a great response. Most of your, or I should say a lot of your intellectual energies have been focused on the philosophy of science. For your generation, were there specific, theoretical or practical elements within that context that made it important for you to focus on the philosophy of science, or how were you brought to really concentrate so much intellectual energy on the issue of science in general?
Yeah, in the 60s, if somebody had told me that, I would have been very surprised. It wasn't where I saw myself going. But basically I chose to concentrate on science because it was the frontier. It was the hard case. It was what I didn't understand well enough and I needed to understand. When I was making the transition from New Left to Old Left to Marxism, I had many of the elements of Marxism already in place without being a Marxist. I was anti-capitalist, I was anti-imperialist, I was a left activist. Philosophically, I would have defined my worldview as processive, contextualist, emergentist, naturalist. I mean, it's all the elements of dialectical materialism. I just didn't call it that. But when I became a Marxist, I could see that there were big glaring holes in my worldview, and they were economics and science. But it was obvious to everybody that, that economics, was, core. But science, that wasn't really so clear to everybody. And the New Left were very weak on science. The whole science for the people were the exceptions. And I even before I formulated this that clearly for myself, I gravitated towards them. I thought they were right. And then even within Marxism, there were anti-science currents. I couldn't understand, once this kind of clicked with me, and I understood how important it was, I decided to devote myself to understanding what these debates were really all about. First, understand for myself, of course. I was first attracted to Western Marxism because, it was left without being communist. Having grown up, with Cold War anti-communism, it was a big thing to make that leap all at once. And I have no apologies for going through intermediate stages. We all have a pattern of development. We don't see everything all at once whole. So I was sorting this out for myself, and then once I really felt I had a position, I felt myself devoted to carrying on that tradition. Because the thing that really sparked me off about the whole series of debates I began to see, this was like in the, let me think, the mid-70s. There's a debate going on in the pages of Marxism Today in Britain, and it went on for months and months and months. It was called the Dialectics of Nature debate. And there was all this stuff, about boiling kettles and the laws of dialectics. And I found in my own party, people just kind of rattled off these laws of dialectics the way we did with the catechism when we were children in Catholic school. But I thought what was really all about to me is Marxism a socio-economic political theory, or is it a theory of everything? Is it a theory of science and nature as well? And I'm a theory of everything kind of person. I've always felt, this push to understand the whole. And so I believed, I was firmly on one side of this debate, but I wanted to see what the debate was all about and how it unfolded and who took positions and why. And I went back even to, 1920 issues of the Journal of the Communist Party of Great Britain. And there was this debate already taking place then. And also in the middle of the Marxism Today debate, there were references to Lukács being, the whole confrontation at the Fifth World Congress of the Comintern in 1924. And then I found my own way to these debates that took place in the Soviet Union in the 1920s. Wow, they were really exciting. In the 20s in the Soviet Union, there were debates about absolutely everything. From, how to organize agricultural and industrial production, to the future of family, to free love, to the relationship between philosophy and science. And I was just alive with this. And the debates were among communists. There's within Bolshevik circles that these debates were fiercest and most interesting. So I was just bowled over by the Soviet Union in the 1920s and also the Comintern in the 1920s. And then I got really into 1930s British Marxism. I was really wowed by Bernal and Caudwell in particular. And I felt I wanted to carry on this tradition. And there wasn't really anywhere that gathered it all together in the one place. And this stream going from Marx and Engels to, that period when I was into it, and then I started with it in the 1970s. I wanted to carry that on. And so I was also, so I was constantly contrasting it with Western Marxism that was pulling the other way against this, but also with, mainstream philosophy of science in Western universities. At this point, I was doing a PhD in philosophy of science at Trinity College Dublin. And it was, a standard analytic philosophy department. And there were I had a lot of hostility to deal with as a Marxist. And in fact, I felt the head of the department would do everything to keep me from getting my PhD, but I did. So, I was plowing a kind of lonely furrow with, things on this side and that side pulling against me. I mean, even, being an active communist wasn't a great career move. And so on the one hand, I was an active member of the Communist Party. On the other hand, I was doing a PhD at Trinity, and I felt like the one would cancel out the other. I wasn't entirely wrong about that until eventually I managed to get a secure position after a while. But, about science, I just felt I needed to understand it. And then once I felt I understood so that I needed to make everybody understand it because I stood in this great tradition. And also, there was this atmosphere among 1960s Marxists that was very dismissive of 1930s Marxists, especially in Britain. This attitude to people like Bernal and Caudwell and Haldane, not in the party itself, but also in New Left Review. I mean, Terry Eagleton once said, "There's nothing to learn from Caudwell except negatively." And I just felt really defensive. They were dead and I was alive, and I was going to take up the argument.
And I'm curious just to ask a follow-up question on the issue of science. There is so much both within the leftist intelligentsia, but then also within broader culture that has claimed that one of the problems with Marxism is that it claims to be omniscient, scientific, objectivist, and other, such categories are often used precisely in order to denigrate Marxism, as if it has this old school attempt to know all things and provide an account of the totality and be systematic in its approach. Is your kind of interest in focusing on the question of science also related to then fighting back against some of these attempts to just disregard the Marxist tradition for being somehow naively scientistic or even maybe positivistic or thinking it can predict the future, or some of the other kind of straw persons that we know that they've made of the Marxist tradition?
Well, they are straw persons, but I've known real embodiments that were kind of close to it.
Fair enough.
and so again, the criticism isn't entirely justified.
Yeah.
But on the whole, if you take the whole thrust of our tradition and our movement, it's not justified. I don't so much say the sentence that Marxism is scientific. I say it's grounded in science. And also in English, the word science means something very specific in the whole academic division of labor. And I don't think Marxism is a science in that sense of what goes on in the natural sciences. And even in some of the bad ways, the social sciences are imitating the natural sciences. But I say grounded in science. And it definitely is. I mean, from Marx and Engels on, and especially the people that were actually scientists who were Marxists, Marxism has a relationship with empirical knowledge. It's not just that you have the principles of dialectical and historical materialism. You know everything. You have to look at the world itself. You have to do the experiments in laboratories. You have to do philosophical thinking about the results of what goes on in laboratories and in science journals, and it's Marxists that can do this most clearly. And one of the biggest problems about contemporary science is the lack of philosophy. And philosophy as science in the Marxist tradition is a very different thing from the narrow methodologism in mainstream Western philosophy of science. It's much more oriented to worldview, looking at the actual results, the actual theories, and the big picture, natural science, and drawing philosophical conclusions from it. Marx and Engels did this. You see it especially in their correspondence. They're constantly talking about, the latest scientific discoveries and what does it mean philosophically. And then in the 1930s, people like Bernal were brilliant at the Bernal Hall here in France, Langevin, Joliot-Curie. It's a really strong tradition, and a lot of names that aren't really very well known now, but in Eastern Europe, I spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe pursuing this, and a lot of the people that were involved in philosophy of science had a background in science. So I say grounded in science, but it's not just what we have to say about the natural sciences and the philosophical implications of the natural sciences. It's the whole way that we understand history. It's grounded in the flow of empirical knowledge and generalizing from empirical knowledge. So I prefer to say scientifically grounded, partly because I'm reacting against the caricature and some of the ways in which people have breathed life into the caricature.
Right.
And also because the term science in English is much more circumscribed.
Yeah. Let's turn then to, I was curious to hear your thoughts on how the kind of Marxist tradition relates to the way in which knowledge has been structured under capitalism. So how does the kind of general bourgeois regime of knowledge production limit the scientific project of elucidating the totality? To take but one example, you're a critic of Western Marxism for, among other things, rejecting the totalizing project of dialectical materialism and maintaining a kind of non-dialectical opposition between the so-called natural and human worlds. This distinction, though, is so deeply entrenched in the bourgeois tradition of knowledge production that it structures the disciplines at a fundamental level, and Western Marxists have been deeply impacted by this. So does a complete overcoming of this distinction require a reconfiguration of our institutions of knowledge, and ultimately a break with the bourgeois approach to knowledge in general, this kind of overall fragmentation, or you could say philosophically the ontology that undergirds the epistemology, so the worldview that separates nature from humanity, that undergirds different regimes of knowledge? And how have socialist countries dealt with the limits of this bourgeois regime of knowledge, or what do you think would be necessary in order to further develop science beyond some of these kind of bourgeois limitations?
Big questions,
Yes.
But then we're philosophers, right?
Yes, exactly.
That's what we're supposed to be doing. So the whole process of knowledge production under capitalism is really a major preoccupation for me. And especially, well, it has been for a long time, but in terms of the way I'm thinking of developing my work in the future. I think Marxism has always been, pretty insightful about this. But, it is knowledge production under capitalism is an area of massive change, even within my lifetime. Let alone, the centuries that, there's been capitalism. Is one of the features of this is a constantly accelerating fragmentation, and an inability to see the whole, to see how this all adds up, to see what are the interconnections. Earlier in my professional life, my political life, but no, I'm talking about universities especially. There were big clashes of contending paradigms. There were discussions of different isms. That's kind of dissipated. I think that, even in the debates there was life. Um, but I think academia has become a kind of theoretical wasteland, if I'm honest. I really think it has. Not that there isn't solid knowledge produced, mostly in the natural sciences. I think what's going on in the humanities and social sciences is all over the place. Um, I've been thinking a lot about the whole trajectory of capitalism in relation to knowledge production, especially the discipline of philosophy, which is disappearing in the scheme of things. It has less and less a place in the scheme of things. There are universities that have got rid of philosophy departments and then even sold off the philosophy books in their libraries.
Mm-hmm.
But when I first went to university in the 1960s, I was really proud of, saying that I was studying philosophy. This was an overview. This was the big picture. This was the most important thing to me. Everything else, fit in, under that umbrella. I almost feel you have to kind of, apologize for being a philosopher, which of course I don't, but I feel I have to justify it in a way that I didn't feel at that time. But I think, looking back, before any of us were around, thinking of capitalism in the world historical stage, I think that in broad terms, I think that capitalism has changed its whole relationship to philosophy in a way that's important to understand, and I'm struggling to understand this, is I think when capitalism was emerging from feudalism, it had need for philosophy to, first of all, to break from feudalism. There was a whole separation of philosophy from theology that was a big part of the bourgeois project and a great move forward in human history. But it needed it to justify itself, to itself even, to define itself and to justify itself. When it was a rising class, when it was struggling for its place in world historical terms. But once in power, I think that its relationship to knowledge production generally, but philosophy in particular, has changed radically. I think it's become more and more conflicted. I think that its radius of cognition has tended to narrow. I think that capitalism is just riddled with contradictions, practical contradictions, intellectual contradictions, and it has less and less of a clear way of thinking to deal with the contradictions that it generates itself. And it's basically become a system that systematically masks the nature of itself as a system. I think this is the key to the intellectual life under capitalism that I think we have to define more precisely. So on the one hand, there's just kind of abolishing philosophy from the scheme of things, but it is something too basic, to be able to eliminate altogether. There always will be people who want to see the whole and see deeper, see wider. I think that the typical philosophies that are generated by capitalism, when it's not complete the philosophies that are generated by capitalism when it can't completely abolish philosophy, are various forms. I know there are 1,000 terms you can use and way these schools of thought name themselves, but basically I think the terrain of contemporary philosophy and contemporary theory, even more generally in other disciplines, various forms of neo-positivism and postmodernism. There are all kinds of different names, but these are the two tendencies. And opposite as they seem to be from each other, the one, purporting to be as rigorously empirical as possible, to pay the closest possible attention to the concrete in particular, and the other just, stratospheric, airy theory that, doesn't touch the ground, the concrete in the particular. They are both plays of the plural. They are both against the whole idea of an encompassing, coherent worldview. They both deny the possibility of grand narrative. And I don't think you can live coherently for a single day without some kind of basic grand narrative. And you know, a lot of people haven't really thought it through. They take them off the shelf. But I think you have to have some kind of story for, you know, your own life and for the whole story of the world. And I think that that capitalism subverts that on various levels and in various ways. And I think that there are actual intellectual arguments, you know, against having coherent criteria for deciding between. You have all these conflicting claims about this, that, and the other. And it's not just that you have the conflicting claims, but capitalism denies criteria for making judgments about conflicting claims, for being able to decide that one theory is superior to another. And this is in the very nature of capitalism in its current phase, in its decline, its decadence, riddled with contradictions that can't be resolved. And this plays itself out in universities in a way that intellectuals just kind of ride along the surface of rather than analyzing them. And I think this is a really serious task, and only Marxists are really able for it. I do see other intellectuals, you know, trying to look at something bigger and make interconnections, but without the grounding that we have, they aren't really able to get very far with it. So I think that Marxism is the only adequate basis for coming to terms with the current conjuncture. So I think that, you know, a lot of other intellectuals, they go into the arena and then they fail to do battle. Like, I've been interested lately, it's a thing that I'm preparing for the World Congress of Marxism in Beijing about this whole crisis in meaning. And I've been looking at this idea of polycrisis. And I think Adam Tooze is quite interesting. That he's become a great theorist of polycrisis, and he sees like all these crises are happening at the same time. There's some kind of interconnections, but then he says there can't be a single cause, and there can't be a single solution. Whereas Marxists, you know, we don't think like that. But I think there, you know, with intellectuals, serious people that are looking at the current conjuncture, there's a kind of need for some kind of big picture analysis of it, and we can't just take shortcuts and give them, you know, a 1930s book on dialectical and historical materialism. That just won't cut it. We have to, you know, be thinking freshly about all of this. So about this theory, this question about reconfiguration of the institutions of knowledge, that's a big question, but yes, that is absolutely required. I think if we look at the whole history of our movement, there have been, you know, many radical experiments in this regard. Look at the early days of the revolution in the Soviet Union, and then again in China especially, where there was really radical energy to reshape knowledge, to scrutinize received knowledge, to critically assimilate what was of value in received knowledge, and then to produce new knowledge and new institutions. Again, this is one of the reasons why that whole period in the 1920s just really captured my imagination. And just all these institutions like the Communist Academy and the Institute of Red Professors, you know, I just tried to imagine what that was like. It just was so exciting to me even to imagine it. And then, you know, in the Comintern, there was the whole International Lenin School. And then in the later period, in the 1970s, I did 2 stints at the International Lenin School myself. And then when you look at China in the early days of the revolution, there was, again, the same ferment in this area. And it was then stepped up during the Cultural Revolution. And the Cultural Revolution did turn crazy and chaotic and sometimes tragic, but it was raising many questions that needed to be raised really sharply. And then, the reaction against it, went too far, I believe, in the other direction. And there was a de-emphasis on Marxism and, this assimilation, to the structures of knowledge in universities, the rest of the world. You go to international conferences and Chinese scholars giving papers pretty much like everybody else, the same mode of discourse, the same underlying assumptions. But I think in the most recent period, kind of corresponding to the presidency of Xi Jinping, there's been a re-emphasis on Marxism. And a new emphasis on radically reshaping knowledge and culture that I think is really important. So, and even in our movement, when we haven't been in power, we've had a lot of experiments in knowledge production, and the New Left, was full of it. On the one hand, we went to academic conferences like the American Philosophical Association, American Historical Association, the whole lot. And of course, we were young, we weren't exactly keynote speakers, but we challenged from the floor people like A.J. Ayer and all these people about the very assumptions of analytic philosophy. And we insisted that we be heard. This was radically rethinking the very nature of our academic disciplines. And a lot of what we did in the 1960s in universities did bear fruit. I mean, there are whole new academic disciplines established. At first, they got Black studies, women's studies. They got new names. Some of these areas became monsters that we never imagined. That kind of focus on the micro problems of the relatively privileged supposed to the oppressed, and the whole identity politics and all that. But in the beginning, there was this, thing, we have to reconfigure knowledge. And there was a big push for history from below, labor studies as well as gender and race studies. And, that's all still there in the universities, not exactly in the way that we imagined it at the time, or I would personally like to see it now. But it's, a lot of the ferment that we engaged in at that time did bear fruit. Universities are different because of what my generation brought to bear on them, and I'm proud of it to some extent. And I think now we have ongoing things. I think what you're doing, the critical theory workshop, this international manifesto group, I go to lots of their things on Zoom. Historical materialism conferences, which started off, in London, and now they're all over the world with big numbers. And broad left, different points of view represented. I think this has been part of our tradition on the left all along, about reconfiguring knowledge and having alternative institutions. And I think that we need to have more of this all the time. And I think that we have new possibilities for doing it. I mean, the whole internet has opened up vast possibilities. And I think that the Zoom's lectures started big time during COVID, but a lot of them weren't about the pandemic at all. We were in all different parts of the world. I've been at some of these seminars with people from every major continent there, and pandemic or not, we just can't be flying all over the world all the time, and we couldn't do those things. And I think that we need to, and you're certainly exemplary in doing this. But I think this is exactly what we need to be doing, because in general in universities, knowledge production has deteriorated even within my lifetime, seriously deteriorated. All the different disciplines are in silos. There are attempts at interdisciplinary research and all that, but some of them are just very shallow, and they don't really do anything that's really important. And I think that we have to, do what we're doing now, but step it up and reach out more widely and bring as many people as we can. But I think we can. But I think, alternative knowledge production is a key activity for the left.
Just picking up on one of the threads in this very rich response, I really appreciated the juxtaposition between the neo-positivism at one extreme and postmodernism at the other. And it does strike me that a lot of what you get in neo-positivism it's an extreme form of empiricism that really fragments the world and doesn't allow for the more ideal or idealist elements of conceptualization and seeing the big picture. Whereas postmodernism is largely idealist through and through and completely divorced from the empirical world. And in this juxtaposition, at least I saw as I was hearing you, and that's the question that I have for you, is that ultimately a Marxist materialist approach solves that problem in the sense that it's not about being an empiricist or about being an idealist, but recognizing that there is a concrete world that we can analyze empirically, but in order to make sense of that world, we have to conceptualize it at a higher order. And if it's making grand narratives or just conceptually seeing a system like capital or capitalism out of all of the different instances, this is precisely the kind of power of the materialist tradition, is it elucidates the dialectical relationship between empirical data and idealist conceptual framing. Idealist here in a very weak sense, right? It's just our ability to conceptualize. And so I'm curious if you would kind of juxtapose the Marxist materialist approach to this, the kind of two bullhorns of a non-dialectical approach that fragments the world empirically or just goes off into la-la land with idealist abstractions.
I think that Marxism is a synthesis of the best of both of these traditions. I mean, they both come from a genuine philosophical impulse to understand the world. Both of these traditions, at their best at least, come from our species struggling to conceptualize the world. And the one side getting too caught up in the particulars, and the other side just, going off and, into generalizations and, losing track of the particulars. But they come from this attempt to understand. And I think Marxism takes the best of those. It is rigorously empiricist in its way, but a non-reductive, non-positivist materialism. It strives to see the whole. It's the best of both of these traditions. I think what exists now isn't even positivism and postmodernism in the sense that these things were a few decades ago, in the sense that they named themselves as isms and argued and faced off. A lot of people that are positivist don't even know about the term positivism. They couldn't tell you what positivism is. A lot of working scientists could not tell you what positivism is. And even in the social sciences, a lot of people, they consider their work rigorous somehow and all this, but it's a lot of it is nonsense. But good natural science is positivist, and it can be productive in a way. But I think both positivism and postmodernism exist now in debased forms, in the sense that they don't name themselves as isms. They don't think theoretically. And I think this is again connected with the degeneration of capitalism and its relationship to philosophy. Mm-hmm. This kind of big push against isms, a discourse about isms at all. And I think we have to name that. I mean, if I look at the history of positivism, there's a lot to admire in it. I mean, because early positivism, it came from this desire to cleanse knowledge of all of the superstition and all kinds of nonsense, and to formulate clear criteria for what was a genuine claim to knowledge. I think that, and even, the Vienna Circle and at this stage, formulating clear demarcation criteria. They're right about that. We need that. We need to bring that back. But like a lot of contemporary positivism doesn't have that kind of drive that early positivism did. And it's Marxism that has, the connection with, materiality and criteria. I mean, a lot of classic Marxist texts before, the Vienna Circle ever came along were arguing about, demarcation criteria. Engels and Lenin in particular, Bukharin. And, this is there in our tradition. But it's, we need to, be emphasizing because of this denial of any kind of coherent criteria for deciding among, contending claims to knowledge. We have to say, yes, there are contending, there are criteria. There are criteria, and a lot of scientists, of course, they have some kind of criteria for, what counts as, a legitimate experiment. And even a lot of, neo-positivist theory, it has value. Popper, there's a value to it to a point. The relationship between induction and deduction, the role of hypothesis, and falsification, all of that. It's of some value, but it's an attempt to to decide what are our criteria. How do we decide what's a legitimate claim to knowledge and what isn't? Because now there's just anything goes. I wonder what Feyerabend, if he was still alive, would think of Trump and really still argue that anything goes.
Yeah, good point. Well, let's turn to the question of culture, because in addition to a lot of your work on science, you've engaged in serious cultural analysis. In much of what passes for cultural studies in the capitalist world, though, it's widely assumed that there are only rival interpretations, and it's not possible, perhaps not even desirable, to be able to engage in a kind of scientific elucidation of culture. How do you respond to such claims? Why is the analysis of culture important to Marxists, and how do we engage in it in a rigorous manner?
Well, I grew up with a mass popular culture of the 1950s. I remember when the first television, came into the house. I was wowed by, American popular culture as a child, TV's cowboys and Indians and puppet shows and, going to the movies on a Saturday afternoon. And I was really wowed by it. But then as I matured, I, subjected it to critical scrutiny. And this became really sharp in the 1960s, because the world as we saw on television and the world we were living on the streets, the gap was, it was an abyss. And we became furious, not about television as a technology, but the picture of the world that emerged, not only in news and current affairs, but even about in the drama productions. Every genre of it just seemed at odds with our whole sensibility, our whole experience of the world. So that set me thinking critically about it, even if I didn't yet write about it. In the 1970s, I started writing a television column for the Irish Socialist, engaging in a kind of ideological critique of the various things that were, in those days, everybody watched the same television at the same time, and, there was a kind of social discourse about popular culture. So, in the movement, we often, we're constantly batting against the mainstream culture that was at odds with our own sensibility about it. Then in the 1980s, I was involved in the early days of cultural studies and the theoretical debates that were going on in universities and at conferences about the whole theoretical basis for cultural studies and this whole question about criteria. And I got particularly involved in media studies, and I started teaching media studies as well, both in news and current affairs and also in television drama. I spent, I always liked watching television drama, and I can't kind of do anything for pleasure without somehow turning it into work. And some people, ask me, oh, does it not ruin it for you? No, it enhances the experience for me, that I can analyze it and make some kind of sense of it. And these days I'm watching a lot of Chinese television drama and, applying the same analysis to it. But I wrote 2 books about television drama and various articles. And so in writing about it, I felt I had to set out a method for analysis of cultural productions generally. And in writing the book about television drama, I set out a method for analyzing television drama. And then later, when I was teaching journalism, not the roll up your sleeves and write an article stuff, but, the theoretical foundations of journalism studies, I felt I had to set out clear criteria. And basically, my method is, to look at cultural productions, first of all, in a wide field, to set them in a socio-historical context, to look at how does this genre function, to ask big questions about the wider panorama, and ask what kind of stories are being told, what kind of stories are not being told, and why not, how are these stories being told, what alternative ways could these stories be told, how are these stories structured in terms of the assumptions they make about what the rules of the game of life are, about gender roles, about race relations, about everything that drama is about. So articulating that, both in terms of a particular production, is this a significant story? What way is the story structured? What are the underlying assumptions? What do the characters represent? But also in terms of a whole field, this whole genre, say the crime genre. And of course, not everyone is the same. So I would tend to say, these are the different ways that genre grows. Because there's some good productions under capitalism, because it leaks. Todd Gitlin was a good early writer about television production. He was a president of SDS in my generation in the 60s. He wrote, there was an article I read by Todd Gitlin in a sociological journal called Primetime Ideology. I thought, click, this is exactly the way I want to go with this. He traced the whole Superman character over the decades and how it changed, society changed. And I thought, wow, I can do this with, many other things, and I did. So basically, I set out this series of questions for interrogating television drama, and a whole chapter that I wrote about it. But at the same time, there's a big pushback against ideological analysis of television drama for just this flaky postmodern, pleasure and genre, just these things that are flaky that never get to the core of anything. And so then when I was teaching our baby journalists this course about, the news agenda, when they're taught how to be journalists, they're taught to structure, basic reporting and how to structure a story in terms of who, when, where, why, how. So I decided to turn that around and ask those questions about the whole news agenda. And again, the kind of questions that I set out to be asked about journalism turned out to be a lot like the questions that I set out for analyzing television drama. What kind of stories are being told about the world in news and current affairs program? What kind of stories aren't being told? What's going on in the world that isn't in the 6 o'clock news tonight? That kind of thing. And again, what are the basic assumptions about, class, race, gender, capitalism, socialism, all this. So, so I see my former students out there, and I thought, did they learn anything from me? Because they get into the newsroom and there's a dominant news agenda and they just seem to go with it. But I tried. But there's just, been this whole pushback within cultural studies against this whole idea of, ideological analysis. And also in the early days of cultural studies, media studies, most of us that were in it came from other disciplines, philosophy, political science, economics, sociology, something else. And now they just study, cultural studies. And in Britain and Ireland, there isn't even the same university structure as there's been in the US. One of the few things, sometimes I actually say the US does certain things better. And that's 101 courses. I think 101 courses are a really good idea. I was shocked when I came to Ireland, and it's the same in Britain, that if you were doing a degree in a subject, you just did that, nothing else. I mean, I can't understand that. You can't do philosophy properly, without understanding, history, biology, all kinds of things. And I always appreciated this about this structure. I don't know if it's still the same, but, when I was young, and I thought that really was better. And again, it has to do with, knowledge and silos. But I think that communication studies, culture studies, media studies actually was better before people were doing degrees in these things, because they brought other disciplines, other knowledge to bear in defining these positions. And I think that the state of these studies, if you look at what was being published in the 80s, is actually stronger. There was a much stronger emphasis on political economy of the media in actual media analysis than there is now as well. When I was teaching it myself, I was looking at a lot of the material that was done by the Open University in Britain, which was very strong. And it's just really lost its way, like a lot of things in academia have these days. So again, in this and other areas, there are these big confrontations of contending paradigms. They've just kind of dissipated without anything having been solved. And it's only Marxism, and then other people that are kind of approximating Marxism without being able to make the step to it, that are really looking at the big picture and trying to deal with things. There's a big prejudice against isms, So and there's just this big move against having any criteria. Now I think there's a problem with the Marxists as well, about especially in the area of ethics and aesthetics. This whole idea that making ethical or aesthetic judgments is just not part of Marxism or something Marxists could do. I don't know if you saw on Facebook, but last year, I guess it was around this time of year, the Olympics were on, and the Olympic ceremony, I didn't actually watch it, but the next day on social media, there's a big pushback against a certain part of the opening ceremony, and I looked at the videos of it, and I just said, people mightn't be talking about postmodernism as such anymore, but it's still there. It's like incorporated into the contemporary psyche, and here's this, this video is an example of it. I think it's decadent. Oh, especially pushback against using the word decadent. And why should a Marxist, make judgments? This is perfectly normal, avant-garde, and all of this. And some people on Facebook were really abusive to me, they read my work on philosophy of science and really respected me, but now, with this, they wouldn't read me anymore, and they were really quite nasty. And then, in October in Beijing, I was giving a lecture about Marxism and culture, and towards the end of it, I made reference to this, the opening ceremony of the Olympics and this debate on Facebook, and then a debate broke out in my class. There were some foreign students there. There was this French fellow. He was a nice young fellow. He was trying to figure out where he was an honest student trying to figure out where he stood, and ultimately felt defensive about French culture and felt he had to defend this. And then everybody got into it. Like the Chinese undergraduates were a bit shocked to see anything like this explode in a class, and all the foreign students were jumping all over it, and the Chinese postgrads, they got into it. And at one point, I had to kind of restore order and say, hold on now, one voice at a time, let's have a proper debate. And they never saw anything erupt to this extent in the class before. It was great. But again, it is there was a kind of attitude among some that Marxism had no business making judgments about things like this, and especially big pushback against using the term decadence. And I think we have to talk about decadence. I think this is a core feature of characterizing the current conjuncture and what is happening with capitalism in our time. So I feel very strongly about these things, and I think we have to have our alternative knowledge production projects such as you're doing to make our case about these things.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time to talk through them and to share with us some of your insights. Greatly appreciate it.
Thank you.